Welcome to the University of Bristol Botanic Garden. My name's Nick Ray and I'm the curator of the Botanic Garden, and today we're going to be looking at one of our core collections, the plants that come from the world's Mediterranean climatic zones. There are 5 Mediterranean climatic zones around the world, and they occupy the area around the Mediterranean Sea, so that's southern and southeastern Europe and parts of North Africa, western and parts of southern Australia, western California, central Chile, and today we're going to have a close look at the plants and the ecology of the southwestern tip of South Africa. Now, this small part of South Africa, which in itself is a large country, represent 0.05% of the world's landmass, yet it contains 3% of all the world's flora. So there's an immense amount of diversity in a very small space. This small area of Africa represents just 0.5% of the landmass of the African continent, yet it contains 20% of the plant species. One of the factors that's led to this diversity is the different geological mixes that we find in the Western Cape. Perhaps the geological type that predominates is sandstone, and it's home to some of the oldest sandstones on the planet, laid down between 220 and 250 million years ago. And the dominant type of sandstone is a geology called Table Mountain sandstone, which forms a mountain belt called the Cape Fold Mountains. Now, we haven't been able to replicate the exact geological type, but what we've done is look into the UK geology and find the oldest sandstone rocks in the UK, and then we've sourced 2 of those types of rock and brought them into this display. Now, these are a little bit younger. They were laid down about 200 million years ago, and the first one here is a rock type from County Durham called Catskill Grit, and the thing that I really want you to see here is these large quartzite crystals, and this is typical of Table Mountain sandstone that you would get in the Western Cape of South Africa, are these large grained quartzite crystals. It's extremely hard and very slow to weather. There's another similar sandstone, but we're going to have a look at it now. We'll walk through the display. Over here, the first thing you'll notice is that the sandstone here is of a different colour. It's very red and rich in colour, and to touch it's extremely rough. This is a large grained iron oxide rich sandstone. It's a little bit younger than the large quartzite grained sandstone, but this is also a typical feature of the geology of the Western Cape. Now, in amongst these sandstone formations, we also get a type of rock which is slightly softer called Malmesbury shales, and that leads to a more fertile soil on which we get a vegetation type called rhinosterbos. We also get the intrusion of granite plumes and domes which extrude upwards. These are extremely hard, and it's difficult for plants to form a community on these granite rocks, but in the cracks and dikes in amongst the rocks, there we get deposits, and often that forms a great opportunity for plants to establish. Plants like this Watsonia here, Watsonias are typically found either in wet seeps and wet deposits or in the moist cracks within rocks, like, for example, some of the granite hills, or koppies as they're known in South Africa. Now, this sandstone in our display here at the University Botanic Garden has been planted up with a community of plants which collectively form a habitat known as fynbos, or fine bush. It was named by the first Dutch settlers to the Cape, and they noted the diversity of the plant communities here, and the fact that many of them had very, very fine, small leaves, and they were unpalatable to the stock that had been introduced by them. But nevertheless, this community of plants supports a great diversity of animals. But if we go back to the rocks are really hard and they're slow to weather. So the minerals in the rocks are leached out very, very slowly, and over time there's been a depletion of minerals in the soils. So this plant community here grows in very nutrient low soils, and that's one of the unique factors about the fynbos community. So plants like this member of the Protea family here, Leucodendron, these have evolved to have specialist mechanisms to get the nutrients they need out of the soil. And one nutrient, potassium, is particularly low in fynbos communities on the predominantly acid soils that they grow on, and so these plants have evolved to grow in very, very low potassium environments. And in fact, if we were to add that nutrient to the soil, we're more than likely to kill these plants. So let's have a little look more at some of the diversity within the plants in this fynbos community. The typical climate of a Mediterranean climatic zone is warm, wet winters, often with quite high rainfall during the winter months. That goes on until early spring, but then there's a cessation in the rainfall, and from late spring into summer, right the way through to early autumn, there's no rainfall, and often there's cloudless blue skies, and a lot of these Mediterranean climates are associated with strong winds created by thermal currents during the summer months. So there's a huge amount of evaporation from the soil surface, transpiration from the plants, and no rainfall. So it's the summer period in the Mediterranean climate that is the dormant time, and these plants have to survive that challenging period, and they've evolved many successful and interesting strategies to deal with that. And one is this a group of plants here called ericas, and there are many plants with small leaves in the fynbos biome, but ericas are very heavily represented. In fact, there's around about 650 species of erica growing on the planet. In South Africa, there are 580 species, but in Western Cape alone, there's about 420 species of erica or heather. If you compare that to Europe, all of continental Europe, we just have 14 species. And here you see very small, hard leaves, well adapted to conserving moisture. The leaves are all over the stem. Often the flowers are hard and dry petals or waxy petals, again able to conserve water loss. The ericas are evergreen, but the total mass of all these small leaves is quite small. Now, another strategy is, which you can see in this helichrysum here, is light reflecting hairs. Now, these have the effect, the twofold effect. One, they act as a type of sunscreening, so they will reflect some of the light that comes from the sun back out to space, which is why we can see them as bright white and silver plants. But also, these hairs trap a blanket of air right against the epidermal layer of cells on the leaves. And that acts as a transition zone between the low moisture air here to the higher moisture air that you would get in the stomatal cavity in the leaves. And so it acts as a buffer zone between the two. And this helps moderate the plant's water loss during the summer period. Now, another strategy to conserve moisture is found here in this shrubby species. This plant is called Gnidea, and Gnideas are one of the endemic genera to South Africa. Endemism refers to an organism that lives just in a local area. And the thing you notice about this is that the leaves are all pointing upwards. So that's unusual. They're not pointing to face the sun to capture the maximum amount of sunlight for manufacturing food. They're pointing directly up. In fact, they're pointing to the midday sun. This is so that they show the minimum surface area to the midday sun when the sun is at its hottest. And in doing this, it prevents the leaves from overheating and losing excess moisture. So the sun that is now beating now in morning time on this side of the leaves, and at the end of the day it will hit this side of the leaves. So morning and at the end of the day is when this plant does most of its photosynthetic activity. And if we look at the bud tip, you can see the leaves are very tightly oppressed at the tip, right to the very tip, so that tip is protected from the sun when it's its strongest at midday. Now, this leaf arrangement has a special name. It's called an isobilateral leaf arrangement, and it's not only Guinidea that it's seen in. We see this in many genera growing in not just only the feignboss, but in many of the other habitats that we find in South Africa, and in fact out of South Africa into many of the other Mediterranean climatic zones. A little bit closer to home in Europe, we see this in olive and filaria. They point their leaves up to the midday sun, but there's a lot of plants in South Africa that have this leaf arrangement. And from a gardening perspective, it's quite aesthetic, and it makes for an interesting feature in this display. Now, another adaptation to a long, hot, dry season is hiding below ground. Now, there are many bulbous plants with swollen bulbs, or plants with storage corms and root or stem tubers that store their water and their carbohydrates below ground, away from the midday heat. And many of these plants become dormant during the long hot summer period. And this plant, Tolbagia violacea, which is a member of the onion family, the Alliaceae, and I can smell the allicin, the smell of onions coming off the broken leaves of this plant. This plant, in moister conditions, maybe at the side of a perennial stream, will remain evergreen, but in extreme conditions it will go completely deciduous and then regrow again in the autumn. Now, the collective term for these storage organs underneath the ground, the bulbs, the corms, the tubers, these plants are collectively known as geophytes. And hiding below ground to get away from that summer dormant period is a very successful strategy. And so much so that there's more species of geophytes in the Western Cape of South Africa than all the other Mediterranean climatic regions of the world combined. It really is an eye-watering amount of diversity. It makes it a very exciting place to actually explore and look at the plants. Now, some of those plants are too tender for us to grow outside here at the University of Bristol Botanic Garden, but they're represented beautifully in our glasshouse displays, where now at the end of summer into autumn, many of them are flowering before the leaves emerge, and then the leaves grow through the winter, and then they become dormant during the summer months. So we grow many of those plants in pots for easy care and cultivation, but there's a few, like the Tolbagia, that we grow outside. So these different strategies help these plants survive the dormant period. But there's an even extreme version. This leafy green, well, it appears leafy, but on closer inspection, these are not feathery green leaves. These are actually green stems. In fact, this plant is almost leafless. Technically, there's a few leaf-like structures on some species, but mainly it's the green stems that are doing all the photosynthesis. This is a group of plants known as the Restios. The plant family is Restianaceae. There's about 280 or so species worldwide. There's 18 in Australia, there's 1 in Chile, and all the rest are found in South Africa. And in fact, they're so dominant and so diverse that they dictate the presence of the fynbos community. So if you're walking in the mountains and you're in amongst restios, you know that you're in fynbos. If there's an absence of restios, then you have moved out of fynbos and you're into one of the other ecological niches. This is a fascinating group of plants. Some will resprout after a flower, after a fire, and some will regrow from seed after a fire. And in fact, this whole fynbos community is a fire-dependent community. So fire is part of the natural life cycle. And when those fires occur, and in nature they're naturally started by lightning strikes, lightning bolts coming, at the change of the seasons, when the atmosphere is disturbed. Of course, with the advent of modern man, they're now started illegally or accidentally, and the oils in the plants mean that this plant material burns very, very fast and very hot for a very short period of time. As the fire war moves on, then the plants will start to regrow. This plant, Canomoas, is a resprouter, so it will regrow after the fire has killed all the stems above ground, and also the seed that is being lying dormant in the soil surface will be triggered to regrow after the fire. And it's not the heat of the fire which is causing that germination, it's the chemical cues contained in the mix of smoke by burning these fynbos plants that provide the germination cues for that seed. I remember travelling in the Western Cape about 20 years ago through a mountain range, and around about 20 miles of the road I was driving on, the mountains on either side were completely burnt. There wasn't a scrap of green. And I drove back through the same valley 2 weeks later, and there's a rash of trillions of seedlings, and all the mountainsides looked like a snooker table, a billiard table, verdant and green with new growth coming through. Now, these have small flowers, almost petalless flowers that appear brown to our eyes, and they have small nut-like seeds. There is a species of Canomoas which has variety Gigantea that has large flower structures and seeds. These are female flowers because we have separate sexes on different individuals. And Canomoas Gigantea has a small pea-like brown or black nut, and on one side is a fatty deposit. It's white in colour, and it looks like a tube of toothpaste is being squeezed out on the dark seed surface. It's called an eliosome, and it's rich in fat and vitamins. And on a hot summer's day, the seed capsules will crack open, the heavy seeds will fall to the ground, and they're collected by ants. And those ants will pick up all the seed, take it off to their little burrows and nests, and they'll put those seeds into their larder. And through the long hot summer months, they will eat the eliosome and feed it, regurgitate it and feed it to their brood, but they have no interest in the seed once the eliosome has been exhausted. And so they will just landfill the seed in their empty galleries of their nest. Now, this process can go on for years, in fact decades, until there's a bushfire. And when that bushfire comes, the chemicals will leach into the soil, and when it rains, the chemicals are dissolved in the rainwater, and the seeds will germinate after a long dormancy, and we see a forest of activity. So it's a really interesting group of plants. There's one other species I need to show you which has a very practical use, and it's here. Perhaps the first thing you notice is there's a great sound, very subtle percussion sound given off by this plant as it blows in the wind. This is a type of restio called Elegia tectorum, and you can see, unlike the Canamois I just showed you, here these stems are leafless and they're single and unbranched. This particular plant is a male, and we've got the inflorescent structures at the tip. But what's interesting here are these hard stems. These were traditionally harvested by the native peoples in Western Cape of South Africa for thousands of years and woven into matting to make their small dome-shaped dwellings, which could easily be broken down and moved as they followed the rains. The first Dutch settlers saw this activity and harnessed the use of this particular restio, Elegia tectorum, for thatching the roofs of their farmsteads and the embryonic buildings forming what would go on to be the settlement of Cape Town. Today, these plants are still harvested effectively from the wild. They're cut with a strimmer once every 7 years. It takes 7 years to get the plant grown back like this. And there are huge farms which have a natural rotation, cutting this, drying, stacking it and grading it, and then it's sold as thatching material. So this is the Cape reed, or the thatching reed. It's harvested in the southern Cape, near the town of Bredasdorp, in the southern Overberg, and it's a renewable resource. It's a really hard, durable thatch. These stems are actually filled with fibres, so they're quite heavy, and we've imported and used this material to be faithful to our design in our South African display, and that's what you see today on the roof of this beautiful rondavel. We can't overstate the profound effect that autumn has in the Mediterranean climate, with a surge of growth. Plants like these amaryllis here, planted against this stone wall, a sheltered position. The wall faces west, probably the most sheltered part of the Botanic Garden here in Bristol. But all that stored energy below ground, the hormone change, switching the growth pattern from dormant to actually grow and bursting that new growth up and making the most of the autumn light. And one group of plants here, the Watsonias, are a member of the iris family. In fact, iris is not represented in South Africa, but the iris family, the Iridaceae, is heavily represented. Watsonia, Ferrara, Ixia, just to name just a few, Casmanthe, just to name just a few of the genera. Well, those plants have been dormant all summer and now they're bursting into growth. And it presents a paradox for us as horticulturalists here at the Botanic Garden, because a lot of the plants in the garden are going dormant and these are now coming into growth. And the reason why we use walls and shelter is because if we do get some hard frost, some of these plants will be damaged. The very tender elements of them are lifted each autumn and put in a cool glass house where the frost is just kept out. It's a lot of work, but it does mean that we can augment this display. Anyway, now we're going to a different ecological niche, and that is the shrubby karoo. So, we leave the fynbos behind, and we come into a more arid area, even more arid than the Mediterranean mountains. As the Cape Fold Mountains run from west to east, some 450 miles, they split and form an ellipse, and in that ellipse is the Little Karoo. North of those mountains, what are known as the Swartberg Mountains, is the Great Karoo, a huge area, rich in annuals, bulbous and xerophytic shrubs adapted to a seasonally dry environment. Here we're showing a number of plant species. This found in the Karoo, in many of the small hills in the Karoo. This is Stebe plumosa, and one of the things you'll notice about it is that the leaves, the stems and the flower buds are covered in minute hairs. There's also waxy deposits here which reflect the light, giving this fantastic colour here. This is drought tolerant, perhaps to the extreme. Lower down, as we get near the coast, we find plants like Passerina. This is Passerina rigida, and here the leaves are tiny scale-like structures which are pressed to the stem. They're set in waxy coverings on the stem, beautifully adapted to a seasonally dry environment. And also by the coast, let's not forget that South Africa sticks out into the South Atlantic and the southern part of the Indian Ocean on the eastern side. So this adaptation means that they're well adapted to extreme windy conditions. We move on up, and here we find a beautiful, exquisite garden plant. This is found in the lower reaches, not the mountains, but the lower reaches when we come out of Fynbos into the ecological niche known as Renoster Veld. We can find patches of this plant, Melianthus major, and you can see it has, we've been looking at small leaves, and this has broad leaves, but they're covered in wax to reflect the light and reduce water loss and protect the leaf tissue inside from damage from ultraviolet light. Now these plants will get quite tall. They get to 2, perhaps in some situations 3 meters, and they'll throw up in winter and early spring a tall inflorescence which can be as high as 2.5 to 3 meters in height, and that has maroon, port wine, burgundy brown bracts and flowers, sometimes known as the honey flower because of the rich nectar that it produces. It's pollinated by sugar and sunbirds, and in fact so much of the South African flora is pollinated by sugar and sunbirds. In fact, bird pollination is a major factor in the pollination of many of these plants. And as the rain patterns move from west to east, and then at the end of summer we get thunderstorms which provide rains, you get these sporadic flowerings of different species, and birds will migrate around following the rain patterns and following the flowering. One such plant that's flowering now in autumn, which is widespread in the southern and eastern Cape, is the lion's head flower, or Leonotus leonorus. Sometimes here at the Botanic Garden this is frosted before it can flower, but if you look at these emerging flowers and see the hairs that are on each flower, it's remarkable. This hairy structure, the orange colour attracts sunbirds. The rigid stem here is strong enough for the birds to land, and then this slightly curved flower is perfectly shaped and mirrors the shape of the sunbird beak, and they'll stick their tongue down in here and slurp out the nectar and move on to the next flower. So let's be clear, when we talk about bird pollination, people often think about hummingbirds, but they're exclusively found in the Americas. That role of bird pollination is done by this big group of birds called sugar and sunbirds. There are other bird families and groups that do bird pollination in southern and South Africa, but they're a very, very important component. And this plant with its square stem, plants with square stem, like this one, are in the mint family, the Lamiaceae. So we will protect this over the next month to prevent the plants from dying. We may lose some of the shoots, but the plants themselves hopefully will survive. But you can see with the new growth, it's just coming into growth. These small, low-growing plants with these cheerful little daisy flowers osteospermums, and this genus is widespread in South Africa, but it's frequently found in Namaqualand, which is a seasonally dry, but in winter and spring, which in South Africa is August, end of July, August, maybe the first week of September, these plants can bloom in great profusion, along with many other annuals and short-lived perennials like the zinnias and dimorthicas and arctotis. They have these cheerful colours over the landscape in great profusion. The advantage of flowering all at once means that you can attract a lot of pollinators and hopefully successfully pollination and seed. Here with our climate in Bristol, these plants are perennial and they overwinter. But it's a small part of the display devoted to kind of illustrating the landscape in this seasonally floriferous area known as Namaqualand. We couldn't really talk about South African plants without talking about pelargonium. There's about 276 or so species of pelargoniums worldwide. All bar 11 of them are found growing in South Africa. And this one here, with these large leaves, with a lovely sort of purple ring on each one, is perhaps one of the most common. This is Pelargonium zonale, which is found not only in the Western Cape, but also in the Southern Cape. And is typically found in Namaqualand, but also shrubby karoo habitats. And it grows in cracks and rocks, up in the kind of mountains, somewhere where it can get its roots in a cool rooting niche underneath a boulder. Here in Bristol, we grow it against this stone wall for winter protection. And they're growing now, they're in full growth now in autumn. And these plants, if they get through the winter, will get about 1 metre high, and then they'll start to bloom with their characteristic pale pink flowers and have a long flowering time. So many of the plants in the Western Cape are endemic to the Western Cape. That is, they're only found there. But there are a few plants that have a wider distribution. And perhaps one of the great surprises is that throughout the mountains of South Africa, running from northeast down through the mountains and into the mountains of the Western Cape, all the way to the Cape Peninsula where Cape Town is, in certain ecological niches, you can find this. This is the African olive. And the ancestors of these plants perhaps were distributed by these fruits being eaten by birds and by migrating birds from north of the equator, where olives are naturally found today in the forests of Armenia, in the Caucasus, and then humans have taken olives and spread them around the Mediterranean zone of Europe and North Africa for their edible fruits and the oil they produced. But this particular species of olive, Olea europaea, this one used to be called subspecies africana. It's recently been renamed. It's now subspecies cuspidata. This one's found in mountain niches all down the Rift Valley of East Africa and down from eastern part of South Africa into the Western Cape. I've seen this plant many times growing in hillsides in the grey and the little karoo. It's not found in the feinbos community, it's found in the karooid scrub. It's unmistakably an olive, and it grows in and around Table Mountain in the Cape Peninsula, where in those sites you look at the urban expanses of Cape Town. A plant that arrived many, many thousands, if not millennia ago, distributed by birds, hopping from mountaintop to mountaintop, taking this northern hemisphere plant to the tip of Africa. South Africa remains one of the most interesting places on the planet to enjoy and study plants. It's of great interest here in a botanic garden, which is planted for teaching, for research, and for engagement of our local population about plants, to have a display devoted to showing some of the many habitats that are found. For us, the feignboss, the shrubby karoo, the Namaqualand flora, and in the summer months we put out a few succulents here as a token gesture for an ecological niche known as the succulent karoo. It remains a fascinating display, and with our fairly benign climate and the use of this lovely stone wall facing west, we can actually grow these plants out here all year round. It's a fascinating place to study and see plants and learn about a few surprises as well. I hope you've enjoyed this little short film about our South African plants growing outside here at the University of Bristol Botanic Garden. This is one of a series of little short films that we're producing, and when the garden is open, do come and enjoy these plants, and hopefully you'll look at them in a new light.